Welcome to Channel's Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka, from our studios here in London. Over the next half an hour, we'll be looking beyond the business headlines by giving you in-depth perspective on the stories that are affecting all of us. Coming up on today's show, India is struggling to cope with a catastrophic second wave of COVID-19. The much celebrated Made in India campaign appears to have failed disastrously, and the rush to secure personal oxygen tanks has left hospitals struggling to stay supplied. Lavina Tandon, the foreign correspondent for India Today, will join me later in the show. And some analysts suggest the investor concerns about the COVID crisis in India could have ripple effects across emerging markets. Nick Krasner, the chairman and founder of the investment banking firm Krasner Capital, will be giving me some insight on investor appetite. Then later, I'll be reporting on the biggest company news stories of the week. But first, let's start the show with business news from here in the UK, where a quarter of adults in Britain are now fully vaccinated against the coronavirus, a milestone that the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, has heralded as a terrific cause for celebration. Figures show that 25% of UK adults, just over 13.2 million people, have now received 2 shots of a COVID-19 jab, while 33.8 million have had at least 1 dose. Earlier in the week, the leading British forecasting group EY Item Club predicted that UK GDP will expand by 6.8% this year, which would be its quickest rate of growth since 1941. This is up from the 5% figure it had originally projected, with expectations being accelerated due to the successful vaccines programme. Unfortunately for the British Prime Minister, it's not the success of his vaccination programme that has dominated headlines this week, but rather a series of Downing Street leaks that has threatened his once unquestionable tenure. Boris Johnson has faced mounting pressure as Tory insiders added weight to newspaper claims that the Prime Minister said he would rather see bodies pile high in their thousands after reluctantly approving a second England-wide lockdown late last year. Boris Johnson has denied saying it. The comments were supposedly made after he felt forced into agreeing to a 4-week lockdown in November. He apparently warned he would never again back another national lockdown. Well, for more on this, I'm now being joined by our business correspondent, Simon Pusey. Simon, the Prime Minister is clearly in a lot of trouble, and it's not just those pretty terrible words that he says he hasn't said.
Yeah, there seems to be a lot of scandals. I think we should focus on the sort of main 3. These are the ones he's been asked about this week, and he's responded them to today. The first one is that phrase, bodies piled high. He'd rather see bodies piled high than go into a 3rd lockdown. This is words he allegedly used in the autumn of last year as we were going into a 2nd lockdown. Obviously, we did end up going into a 3rd lockdown. But these words have been leaked by someone, and Boris seems to think he knows who it is, potentially his former advisor, Dominic Cummings. But they're obviously very sort of inflationary words to use, given so many people have died and so many people know people who have died in this country, that for your leader and someone who's supposed to be leading you through this terrible time to have said he'd rather see lots of people die than, so it's caused a big outrage, and he's been asked about it many times. He's, to be fair to him, denied it each time, but lots of broadcasters say they have multiple sources that confirm he's used this. I guess the question now is there any evidence that can prove that he did? So far we haven't seen any, but there seems to be this drip of things coming out against him, so we'll have to watch that one. The second one is the Downing Street flat, which is where he lives with his fiancée, and expenses. Now, this is a kind of minutiae within Westminster, but again, it's a can we trust the Prime Minister? Has he done the right thing, or has he been illegally funding things to benefit himself and his fiancée? Again, he says that he paid for it himself and that he's done nothing wrong, but crucially, an investigation has now been opened, an official investigation. That kind of helps him in the short term, because he can always just say, look, I can't say anything about this until due process. And we'll have to wait months for that to come to a clause. And then there's the third thing, which is the text with James Dyson, which we discussed last week. There's just a couple of things that are coming out now in terms of leaks. And I think, a couple of days ago, we were told that he was on the phone to newspaper editors to give his side of the story. And for someone who says he doesn't have enough time to open a COVID investigation yet because he's too busy doing other things, to be picking up the phone to newspaper editors to give his side of the story of things, it shows that he is really worried about this person who is leaking these things. And I guess what everyone's looking for now is, what more does this person have? Are there multiple people? Are these people currently in the government who want to become Prime Minister next. So there's this sort of infighting and this backstabbing within the Conservative Party, which is quite unlike them because they're usually the ones that can keep it together, and therefore they're the party in power because they just make sure they stick together. So it seems to be unraveling slightly there. But I guess what people are looking for now is there going to be any evidence that he did say that phrase, bodies pile high? Are there going to be more allegations? Is there going to be any proof? Will that investigation find him guilty in the Downing Street flat? So lots of things going on. And, you know, with the good news about we're sort of coming out of COVID, we're coming out of lockdown, the 17th of May, there's going to be more things opening up. You know, vaccination's still going very well. You'd think Boris Johnson would be riding high. Having said that, who knows what's going to happen in local elections soon? He may still get a huge majority, in which case, I guess that means the British public don't really care.
Got to ask you very quickly, Simon, could this threaten his tenure? Could he go?
Yeah, well, I think so. I think he's been very good at sort of riding through these storms because he has this sort of charm about him. He has a way of wriggling out of things and of basically saying to people what they want to hear, and therefore not really being sort of forced to. A lot of people says he tends to lie quite a lot, which might help him, you know, be able to dodge tough questions because he just says what he thinks people want to hear. But I think crucially it will be these local elections that are coming up that are often sort of seen as a bellwether as to how popular a prime minister is or a leader is. And it looks like he's lost a couple of points since all these allegations started coming out. But that will be the real test, because if it's then coming across in the polls, then maybe the Conservatives are going to start to get a bit worried about who their leader is, and maybe they might need to think again.
Thank you, Simon.
Thank you.
Now to our next topic. India has become the epicenter of the world's deadliest second wave of COVID-19. The country has seen more positive coronavirus cases in the last 7 days than anywhere in the world, and experts believe the actual number may be far higher. The surge is not only a catastrophe for India, but for the entire globe, as allowing the virus to circulate unchecked increases the risk that dangerous new strains will emerge. Investors are concerned about the pace of the country's economic recovery, as the expansion of coronavirus curves has impacted businesses across several sectors. Well, for more on this, I'm now being joined by the foreign correspondent for India Today, Lavina Tandon. Lavina Tandon, it's always a pleasure to have you on Channel's Business Global. There are some shocking headlines, not just here in Britain, but across the world. Was the return of the virus in India inevitable?
Yes, you see, we all will face and have faced, and some are going to face, the second wave of the virus. So the return of the virus was inevitable, but the preparedness for it and what the responsibility that people should have taken and how they could have prepared in the interim for it was quite shoddy and has been quite shoddy. So yes, I agree the return was inevitable, but the devastation that we are looking could have been curbed.
Yeah, there have been some really horrific images, and it's important to say not just in India. I think every single country across the world has had those shocking images. Sometimes when they're coming from outside Britain, they all seem to be worse. But we know Britain have also struggled with the coronavirus. But there are issues, Lavina, about discrepancies. We know that local journalists who have cross-checked hospital figures with their own figures say that the discrepancies are huge. Do you think there is a fear that the COVID numbers are much higher than what Modi would have some people believe?
The COVID numbers definitely would be higher, and there are multiple reasons for it, apart from the government trying to maybe do some fudging up, as you said, but there's also various other reasons for it, and that is because a lot of the people, like in UK, were not tested because they saw the symptoms and then they didn't go for testing. There are many others who are kind of waiting outside, and the tests, so the testing is not complete. That's another reason for it. Sometimes the test results are not accurate, and sometimes the test results, people don't go to the hospital because the fear of getting COVID. Or in India, what's happening is that once you are, say, for example, I take the place where my parents live, my family lives in Mumbai. So if you go for a test and they tell you that you're positive, then the local authority is told that you're positive, and then the whole building knows that you're positive. So a lot of people don't want to be kind of, they see it as a stigma and they don't want to go through that process. So if they have a symptom, they carry on with the treatment. So there are multiple reasons, but definitely the numbers are surely quite high than what we see now.
Absolutely. The surging caseload has scattered trust in the government, especially because earlier this year, Modi was waving the flag, wasn't he? Especially because, India had done so well in, providing vaccines across the world. It seems as if he let it slip just a bit, and now it's surging out of control. We're hearing about reports of short of staff in hospital. There's no beds, blood, drugs, oxygen, even oxygen canisters. What's the mood like, in the room, on the ground? I'm sure you're speaking to your family. Are people over projecting this, or is it as bad as the media would have us believe?
No, not over projection at all. I think we wake up here, especially those here in the UK, and our families are in India. We wake up distressed, and I look at the Twitter. It's distressing. We speak to the families. It's distressing. So distress, anger, helplessness. That is definitely what we feel, though definitely on the ground. I don't even want to see, and it is really not something that one would have at all wishes afar. I think, what is the word I'm looking for, that we wanted to see really the situation. And yes, I think I want to just quickly go into the fact that India thought that they have won the COVID war, they have arrived, and the overconfidence has been the kill, I suppose, because when the first wave, in fairness, they did quite well. And they locked down and all of that happened quite well. And it was not managed very well, I have to say. And I think the fear of what happened at the time, that the migrant workers were suffering, and all the stories that went around of when we spoke as well, and all the economic damage that it did, probably a little bit of that hangover went into a situation where the lockdown, some doctors say here to me that it didn't happen in time when it should have happened. Secondly, the preparedness. So a lot of the countries in the UK as well, we can find faults here as well, but then we were preparing, we were building up our oxygen capacity, building up the hospital capacity. That was not done in India. That's the second point. People got overconfident. There were marriages, there were people who were coming out, and even from the point of view of the people, it just felt like normal. And then we spoke to people at home, families at home, friends at home, said, oh, it just feels like normal. You used to feel jealous that, wow, it's because of young population, it's hot. But India has won the war of COVID, but not really. And we are seeing the result now. There are two other things that have massively contributed to this number and the anger. That's why I'm bringing this into your question is, of course, one is the local elections, state elections. They definitely should have postponed. Yes, they were announced at the time when there was less number of COVID cases and all of that. But once something should have been done, possibly postal wars, possibly doing something. These rallies should not have happened, because now the surge that we are going to see is in West Bengal, where the election rallies were held. Number two, the Kumbh Mela, which is the religious festival that comes every 12 years in the country. Of course, it is very religious, but the most alarming thing about it is that it was preponed by a year. It was to happen in 2022. It was preponed because they thought that is the most auspicious moment. I don't want to go into explaining what that means, but once in 83 years, this moment comes. That happened to be in 2021. And so it was preponed, and that has been actually the disaster. The Mela really signifies washing of sins and people jumping into the Ganges. They have washed off people and have got them across to heaven, possibly. God bless them. So it's really anger. I feel angry as well that this festival should have been, even if it was envisaged at the time when there were COVID numbers were less, it should have been stopped, or it should have been just in a ceremonial manner where 2 or 3 people were present, the saints or something. So that these things have contributed to the numbers that we see today and the distress, anger, and helplessness, and there is a lot of it.
Clearly, there is. I can hear it in your voice, and obviously, we're seeing it on our TV screens. Lavina Tandon, India clearly has got itself in a precarious situation, but we know the Indian strength, so we know certainly, and their medical capacity, they will be getting themselves out of this, hopefully sooner rather than later. Lavina Tandon, thank you so much for joining me on Channels Business Global. Coming up on Channels Business Global, I'll be discussing the emerging market investment outlook for 2021 with Nick Krasner, the chairman and founder of the investment banking firm Krasner Capital. See you after the break. Welcome back to Channels Business Global with me, Juliana Olayinka, from our studios here in London. In a moment, I'll be speaking with Nick Krasner, but before then, here's some company news for you. A long-delayed travel bubble between Hong Kong and Singapore will begin on May the 26th as the two cities move to establish overseas travel links and the hurdle of quarantine for visiting foreigners. The window is applicable for anyone who has remained in either city for 14 consecutive days before their date of departure, irrespective of nationality. Flight prices shot up following the announcement. The corridor was first slated to begin in November last year, but was suspended after a sudden spike of COVID infections in Hong Kong. Hong Kong residents would need to be fully vaccinated before their date of departure to Singapore. The vaccine requirement does not apply to Singapore travellers heading to Hong Kong. The travel bubble is the second major air route in the region to open after Australia and New Zealand resumed flights last week. GameStop shares rose 15% earlier this week after the video game retailer raised $551 million from selling additional stock. GameStop announced that at-the-market stock offering as a way to capitalise on its recent head-turning rally that made Wall Street history. Since then, the GameStop has attracted several executives with e-commerce and customer care backgrounds to help the company reinvent itself as a digital retailer. The company recently announced its CEO, George Sherman, will step down by July the 31st, and former Amazon and Google exec, Jenna Owens, will become its new COO. Shares are up nearly 800% this year. The Publishers Association in Britain has published figures which show that book sales, particularly from fiction and audio, soared in 2020, with consumer sales up 7% to £2.1 billion. Bestsellers included The Thursday Murder Club by Richard Osman, Girl, Woman, Other by Bernardine Evaristo, and 7 Ways by Jamie Oliver. But educational book sales slumped as schools were shut for several months. Now to our next topic, the emerging market outlook for 2021. Data for the first 3 months of the year show there is a robust appetite to invest in infrastructure, education, healthcare and sustainability. However, COVID risk, insecurity and corruption threaten to dampen sentiment. For more insights, I'm now being joined by Nick Krasner, the chairman and founder of the investment banking firm Krasner Capital. Nick Krasner, thank you so much for joining me on Channels Business Global. I've got to start with the main story of the week, really, which is India. We know that, unfortunately for that country, they have found themselves at the epicenter of the COVID-19 crisis. And unfortunately, this has had a ripple effect on risk appetite for emerging markets. We know that money had been poured in throughout the start of the year, but some investors are getting a little bit risky because of what they're seeing in India. What's your take on that?
Yeah, Juliana, I think what's happening in India right now is very worrying indeed. Firstly, I think everyone's heart goes out to all of the people suffering from their second wave. I think investor sentiment is slightly wary. I think that where we are in India today is probably where we were back in March 2020 in the UK, where there's a little bit of a pause. That said, you need to look back at historic data. So the last 10 years has really seen the India revival of private equity and inward investment. So just last year in 2020, we saw $47.6 billion of private equity investment into the country, which is very significant. So what I anticipate for 2021 is a slight slowdown between sort of now and probably the summer, and then hopefully continued investment into things like the technology sector, which has really been holding the economy up and booming. So yes, a slight pause now while people get their head around really troubled times where the Indian health services are doing really challenging job. And then I can see investors really coming back and looking at India for the long term and being rather bullish on that market.
Absolutely. I believe the Sensex and the Nifty 50 have increased slightly after last week's drop. Shifting away from COVID risk, got to talk about insecurity. Pretty difficult not to talk about insecurity and Africa and investments. First of all, a couple of weeks ago now, we had Total pulling its expats out of Mozambique after that horrific terror attack. Don't know if any of our viewers need reminding, but Nigeria is currently in a storm of insecurity up and down the length and breadth of the country. And then, of course, corruption. The British government have just imposed sanctions on the Gupta family. Is corruption, insecurity in Africa still a major cause for concern for investors like yourselves and anyone else who's looking at the continent?
Yeah, I think it is. I think that there's been a huge transition over the last sort of 5 or 10 years where perception has changed. However, corruption is still rife in certain sub-Saharan African markets, and it's something which is which we all need to stop and take account of. I think first, just looking at Mozambique, I think Total's decision to halt its operations in Mozambique indefinitely is a shrewd decision, because the insurgency on that part of the region has been really very troublesome. So I can see that the largest private sector investment in sub-Saharan Africa in all history halting, but correctly so. I see that the situation with the insurgents also impacting that East Africa booming part of sub-Saharan Africa, because Tanzania just to the north and of course Kenya have long been the golden childs of that region. And clearly with Somalia and piracy just to the north, and Mozambique with a really quite significant risk of insurgency, that's going to not only have an impact in Mozambique, but is also going to spill over. I think then moving across to fraud and corruption, we've had a change of government in major markets. So South Africa has gone past the Zuma government, which clearly had a number of inherent issues that went with that office. And we're seeing a cleaning up process, but clearly that cleaning up process will be a long one. And both the African Union and also independent national governments have an important role to play in that, as do the Brits, as do the French, as do the Americans, and any other stakeholders in the region. So we are seeing that that is a work in progress. We're still very, very bullish on what's happening in sub-Saharan Africa. There's still very exciting private sector deals to be done, and also a thriving and very ambitious plan for trade, both between the UK and sub-Saharan Africa, and then just more generally. So a long-term bullish approach, but certainly clear, cautious eyes on fraud and corruption.
Absolutely. You talk about opportunities. You're citing the statement really from the African Development Bank president. They've just wrapped up the UK Africa Green Investment Forum last week. And again, you know, he's reiterating the points that there are so many opportunities in Africa, particularly in this post-pandemic recovery. One of the big talking points, Nick, during that conference was, the clean green economy. We know that there's already a transition taking place in the West. Are you interested in the green or the circular economy in Africa? Is that where investors, are heading to?
Hugely excited by the conference last week, and both the momentum in green tech, green energy, renewable energy, and indeed the circular economy that you mentioned. I think that let's not forget, Africa has done much better than we had anticipated throughout 2020 and throughout the COVID crisis. I think that Africa is one of the lowest producers of greenhouse gases as a region, but has been one of the biggest sufferers of the consequences, i.e. climate change, etc. So as a group of investors, people are now looking for, of course, continued infrastructure investment, but also looking to tap into that green economy. In sub-Saharan Africa in particular, there is an amazing opportunity to bypass conventional investment cycles and go to the next stage. We've seen that in mobile usage, so landline technology that we missed that curve and went straight into mobile. And I see that the green initiatives is almost doing the same thing. So I'm hugely supportive of all of those initiatives. And, just from an ethical perspective, we've long been championing green tech, green investment, and indeed anything that has a much stronger ECG and social conscious from an inward investment perspective. So very positive indeed.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Nick Krasner, chairman and founder of Krasner Capital. Thank you so much for joining me on the show. Sadly, that's all we have time for today, but do get in touch with your comments and suggestions. I'll see you at the same time next week for more in-depth business analysis on Channel's Business Global. Goodbye.